My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing Young Washington, a recent biopic about the big guy himself. I'm Gary Holmes, and joining me today via Zoom from California is Jim Robinson. Jim, what is your favorite relatively unknown fact or anecdote about George Washington, which may or may not have been revealed in this movie?
Well, I don't know about how unknown it is, but I have to say it was devastating to me when I learned that as a boy, George Washington didn't chop down a cherry tree and he didn't go to his father and say, I cannot tell a lie. It was totally made up by a historian back in the early 1800s. And then I learned also that he didn't have wooden false teeth like a lot of people said he did. He did have false teeth, but they weren't made of wood, and that was almost too much to bear. So it's learning the known facts that are actually not facts that strike me.
I thought you were going to say that that he had false teeth, and he really did have false teeth, and he did, but they were ivory and made out of human slave teeth and stuff. Uh,
Right.
all right, well, my fact is actually the main focus of this movie, which is that George Washington started the first real World War, which, contrary to popular understanding, is not World War One. The skirmish we see in this movie between him and the French precipitated what we call the French and Indian Wars, but which is known to the rest of the world as the Seven Years' War. I know that you told me you're not an expert in the French and Indian Wars. Neither am I, and I know you're definitely not an expert in the Seven Years' Wars. But I've heard this enough that I wanted to look up what the Seven Years' War is, and I'm just going to read to you from Wikipedia. It says the Seven Years' War, fought from 1756 to 1763, was a global war fought by numerous great powers, primarily in Europe, with significant subsidiary campaigns in North America, the Indian subcontinent. The primary warring states were Great Britain and Prussia, fighting against France and Austria, with other countries joining these coalitions, including Portugal, Spain, Sweden, and Russia, plus Saxony and many other minor states of the Holy Roman Empire. Related conflicts include the Third Silesian War, French and Indian War, the Third Carnatic War, the Anglo-Spanish War, and the Spanish-Portuguese War. This is a war that is almost never taught in school or the subject of any of these dad-oriented history books because it's just too big and too complicated for anyone to wrap their heads around. And it was set off when George Washington was sent to warn the French to stop building a fort in the area that is now the city of Pittsburgh. So that's my
Well, thank you for that, Gary. One reason I have an aversion to trying to figure out this war is because I grew up in Glens Falls, New York, which
yeah.
is about 6 or 7 miles from Fort William Henry, which was one of the battles that the French actually won. And in the course of having to learn about all that, I had to memorize every Indian tribe under the sun of the 5 nations or 6 nations or whatever the hell it was. And I think I just developed an aversion to it. I got my requisite A on the quiz and then I put it out of my mind. But I think it is an important war if you reflect on it because apparently fighting it put the British in so much debt that that's why they decided to impose all these onerous taxes on the colonies. And those taxes led to the revolution, which we celebrated its 250th Independence Day just recently.
Well, that's right.
So
And
it's valid.
the other thing is that if it hadn't been for the French and Indian War, the United States would never have been able to expand west. Or if they did, they'd have had to expand into French territory because Canada was French, and it went all the way down to the into Pittsburgh, as I said, and was headed south along the Mississippi River. So we would have been hemmed in if the British hadn't won this war and basically taken over half the continent.
Well, I guess we ought to rename World War One. It's now World War Two, and World War Two should forevermore be called World War Three.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, but it is crazy though, that there's this huge war that happened, and I don't think anyone talks about it because they can't understand it. It is so
Uh,
complicated, and I know about so many other wars, but they just sort of like, we're not going to get into this one because I don't
Good.
understand it.
So we've done it.
We've done, yeah. We've talked about the war enough. Okay, so we've talked about a little bit about George Washington when we discussed The Patriot, which was about the American Revolution in the Southern states. I don't want to repeat everything we said about him then, but maybe we can dig a little bit deeper now into how Washington is perceived in America and the world, because that has a lot of bearing on what this movie is trying to achieve. So, what do you think about Washington's image?
Well, I think his standing in history and the country and among most Americans is pretty secure and solid. And that is that he truly was the father of the country, was a great man, a unifying force, and every bit as consequential as advertised. The problem is that image wise, he is just so ancient and obscure. I mean, the first image that comes to mind to me and probably most Americans is that damn Gilbert Sullivan unfinished
Gilbert
Athenian
Stewart.
portrait.
Gilbert Stewart.
Gilbert's, yeah, yeah. I could have said Gilbert O'Sullivan, who's even a different, Gilbert Stewart, unfinished Athenian portrait that appears on the dollar bill, unsmiling and dour and
Yeah.
stern. And so I think he's got an image problem because we can't relate to him as a person.
Well, you're right, and the reason he was smiling, I was never smiling, is for something you talked about earlier, which is he had those stupid false teeth, and he looked he never could smile because his mouth hurt, and the teeth just looked terrible. So,
Yeah, and even his monument in Washington evokes nothing about the man or fixes for us a real life image of Washington in our minds compared to the very moving statue of Lincoln, for example, in the Lincoln Memorial. All we've got with Washington is just a phallic symbol to underscore that he's the father of the country. Yeah, at least we have Mount Vernon now.
well, he was the father of the country and no one else. He built that image for himself though because he wanted to be perceived as a man of honor and virtue, like the leaders of the early Roman Republic. He was a guy of great self-control who generally suppressed his emotions, although he did have a volcanic temper that occasionally erupted as president when he read news articles about himself. Not the last president to do that, of course. I think it's irrefutable that we never would have achieved independence at that point, at least, without him, because he held the army together for so long. We also need to point out that he was famous in America, Great Britain, and France when he was only 22 years old, not only because of his involvement in the conflict depicted in this movie, but because his write-up of the battle was published in the colonies in England and became a sensation. So by the time he was 22, 23, 24 years old, he was known throughout both France and the UK. I mean, the King of England knew his name when he was only 23 years old.
Yeah, and as we've discussed before, it's always extra remarkable when somebody can become a national or global celebrity without any of the communications vehicles that we have today. It just seems more astounding to me that that happens.
Well, back then they had newspapers, many,
Yeah.
many, many newspapers, and people back then are the same as they are now. I mean, they follow trends and they sell they print what sells, and so anyway, he was famous as a youth, and basically was famous for his entire life.
Well,
All
that's
right.
why I welcome a movie like this that at least tries to breathe some life into the person. Because as I said, to me, and I think most others, he's just obscure. I even conjure up all those President's Day birthday ads where they have his picture from the dollar bill and they have his mouth moving, talking about the great deal that you can get down at the used car lot.
All right. Well, speaking of the movie, let me do a little summary for those of our listeners who haven't seen the movie. So it begins with the death of 10-year-old George Washington's father. This means that little George and his mother significantly lose their financial security and social status and must move on to a small farm. This also means the end of George's formal education. Fortunately, George's older half-brother Lawrence takes him under his wing, and when we jump ahead 10 years, George has learned how to be a surveyor. He is burning with ambition, but also resentment that the British Army will not accept him as an officer because he cannot afford to buy his way in. He does manage to impress Thomas Fairfax, the biggest local landowner, and gets a commission to survey Fairfax's holdings in the Ohio Valley, which is way out there in the wilderness. As it turns out, both the French and British claim this area, and when Washington returns to Virginia, he convinces the colony's lieutenant governor, Dinwiddie, great name, to let him lead a regiment of Virginia militiamen to confront the French and tell them to get lost. Unfortunately, Washington's Indian guides hate the French and don't follow European rules of war anyway, and they ambush and kill about a dozen French soldiers, which precipitates the French and Indian War. After this disaster, the 22-year-old Washington continues to bungle his command and ends up surrendering to the French in a follow-up battle. He tries to resign his commission in disgrace. But when the British send a real general with real British soldiers to push out the French for good, Washington humbly signs on as a lowly advisor. And when the French again slaughter this even more experienced British troops, Washington springs into action, racing back and forth to rally the troops so they can have an orderly retreat. Miraculously, although everyone on the other side is trying to kill him, he seems impervious to bullets and returns to Virginia a hero, having evolved from a callow, stubborn youth into a more humble, more disciplined leader.
That's very good. I'm glad I listened to it because it's been a little while since I saw the movie, and maybe almost a month. And I saw it in the theater, as I think you did.
Uh-huh.
And therefore, we can't do our usual stop and starting of videos and relying on subtitles and such. So thank you for that.
Yeah, we'll be struggling with some of our finer details here, and if we need to remind each other that didn't happen or that don't forget this, please forgive us because, as we mentioned before, it's very hard to take notes in the movie theater.
How did it do? How does the movie?
Well, it's still in the theaters, and up to date, it's earned about $45 million at the box office, which is very respectable for a niche movie like this. Worth noting that all of this is domestic receipts. It's not playing overseas. So 45 million in the US alone is not bad. This compares this year to Toy Story 2, the top movie so far, which is a domestic box office of 448 million, with 10 times more, followed by the Super Mario Galaxy movie, Michael, Project Hail Mary, and The Odyssey, which I saw yesterday, and which is probably going to be the most popular movie of the year.
So George Washington lost in a landslide.
George Washington lost to Toy Story, yes, but
however, I read that the movie only cost 20 million to make. So on a percentage basis, this may just be one of the most successful movies that we've ever discussed here, since most of our movies are unmitigated flops.
And I heard just today, as a matter of fact, that they are making a sequel.
They are.
It's called 17. Yeah, right. Okay. 1776.
Yes. Yeah, and hopefully this 1776 will be without the actors singing their lines. It's a great idea to do a sequel. In fact, hopefully there'll be a trilogy. You've got this one that we're going to talk about, 1776, which could be the Revolution, and then maybe a final one, the presidency, and then to the end of his life. I think that would be a great package.
Well, I also heard that the producers of this movie intend to do a series of movies about this era. So I guess 1776 will be the next one, but we might see something on, I don't know, Jefferson or Hamilton. Hamilton's the one they should do. I want to use this moment to talk about The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell. Are you familiar with this whole concept of the hero's journey?
No.
Okay. So The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell, it will kind of inform our commentary about young Washington. It's in the classic formula, the hero begins in the ordinary world, in which he receives a call to adventure, and then crosses the threshold into an unknown world. During the initiation, the hero navigates the unfamiliar world by facing tests, allies, and enemies, at which time he faces the ordeal, or his greatest challenge, after which he claims the reward. The hero then starts the road back to the ordinary world, undergoes a resurrection that tests his transformation, and finally returns to the elixir, bringing the newfound gifts to the community. And this is based on Joseph Campbell's study of myths throughout history and through various civilizations. It's a real standard trope. Some examples include, I just mentioned, the Odyssey. Odysseus in the Odyssey goes on a hero's journey. Jonah and the Whale, Ishmael in Moby Dick, Huck Finn, Holden Caulfield, and all the Star Wars characters, Harry Potter, Hunger Games, and now we have George Washington as the Harry Potter of the Revolution.
That's a pretty heavy baggage for a popcorn movie, but that's interesting. That's a very interesting point.
Anyway, it's important to note the movie was made by Angel Studios, which occupies a somewhat unique role in the film industry ecosystem.
Yeah, it's a very interesting. They call themselves value-based entertainment. And it's an interesting story. It began as a video filtering service to weed out excessive profanity and violence and sex, and then redistribute the videos through streaming. And of course, they got sued because they were using and doctoring copyrighted product. Then, through a true grassroots approach, they used crowdfunding and membership dues to finance productions that were chosen through votes by members. So it's sort of a bottoms-up, self-selected group of people self-selecting what projects should be pursued. They did a TV series called The Chosen, which is about Jesus. They did The Sound of Freedom about child sex trafficking that grossed $250 million on a minuscule budget, and a bunch of others, and now Young Washington. And at least in Washington, it doesn't hit you over the head with any preachiness that I could see. Though as I was walking out of the theater, I don't know if this happened in your case, Kelsey Grammer came on the screen with some kind of pitch, and I didn't even stay to listen. I assume it was to join the Angel community. I wonder if some of the mixed reviews on the negative side were inspired in part because of the general aversion of critics to anything seen as traditional or conservative.
Yeah, I think that's probably. I'm sure. I'm sure it is. You know, Angel, its niche is that they try to exploit Christian and conservative grievances against Hollywood for making left-wing and overtly anti-religious movies. Even though Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ made an enormous amount of money, and you already mentioned The Sound of Freedom, you know, there is definitely a market for family-oriented Christian movies, and Hollywood just will not make them. So you've got you know, little Angel Studios stepping into the breach here.
Yeah, all power to them.
By the way, I've watched The Chosen. The Chosen is the story of Jesus and his disciples, and it's a legitimately very good TV show that you could watch even if you're not particularly religious. But it's also one of these things that no one's heard of except for me and my church friends. You know, I mean, it's a huge hit. Millions and millions of people watch it, and it goes completely sort of underground because, you know, mainstream press is not interested in writing about Christian successes like that. So let's talk about having put all that as background. What did you like about the movie?
Well, overall, I was entertained. Anything humanizing Washington with a decent level of competence is good in my book for the reasons we discussed before. I keep calling this in my mind and here a decent popcorn movie. I like that it didn't sugarcoat his ambition and his mistakes as a young man. And it succeeded for me on a pretty low budget in placing me in the milieu of the mid 1700s. It felt realistic to me as opposed to modern people in modern sets pretending they were in the 1700s.
Well, I think you're right. They probably couldn't afford to do any CGI work. So they had to use real sets and real uniforms and all that kind of stuff. I thought it was an exciting action movie, particularly in the second half. So I like that. I also, even though I knew the basics of the George Washington story, sometimes it helps to see it dramatized to really understand what the written page is telling you. And I think I finally do get the first phase of Washington's military life, which I've been reading about in these biographies for all these years.
Yeah,
It's hard to get that stuff in your head unless you see it on screen.
yeah, and I haven't been reading those biographies through the years. All I know about Washington is basically what I learned as a school kid, and so I liked being reminded and or told for the first time about some of what his early life was like. I had no idea that he lost his father as a boy, etc. And I agree with you. I thought the battle scene, particularly toward the end, was actually very suspenseful. And I think they accomplished that without doing what the Patriot did, which was make the violence too gratuitous.
Yeah.
This was, if there is such a thing, this was more tasteful violence than the Patriot.
Yeah, although I will say one of the things I was going to say that I liked about it was they didn't sugarcoat a word you've already used, but they didn't sugarcoat the brutality of the Indians. You see them bashing in the brains of the French. To say that that's really the only time that there was really some graphic violence. But the Indians are also given the dignity of being human too. They're not victims or noble savages, but warriors trying to play off one imperial power against the another. So there was none of this pretending that the Indians are any different than any other tribe of humans.
The other thing is, I appreciated seeing and learning about Washington before this image became fixed of him as sort of a patrician, plantation owner, noblesse oblige kind of father figure reigning benignly over the whole country, and instead seeing him as kind of an outcast, lower class from the point of view of the British elite. And he couldn't even get the girl due to his inferior standing in society. He's frozen out of opportunities. And none of this I either didn't know or I had forgotten was a big part of his upbringing.
Yeah, and I just have one other thing I'm going to point out, which is so much of the movie takes place in the wilderness, and I liked being reminded of just how vast and untamed the continent was just 300 years ago.
Yeah, and when we talk about this is part of the confusion of the war, when we talk about the Ohio River Valley
Yeah,
in this movie, we're talking about Pennsylvania, right?
yeah,
Yeah, we're
exactly.
not talking about Ohio. So that's the kind of thing that laymen like me, I said, what? Wait, why does Virginia care about Ohio? Well, because Virginia is a lot closer to, especially with West Virginia being part of Virginia, to Pennsylvania than Ohio.
Well, I mean, and that just goes to show that we think of Pennsylvania as kind of a decent sized state, but not maybe not even that big, but only about half of Pennsylvania was actually in the British ownership at that point. I
Yeah.
mean, they half of it was claimed by the French. So let's talk about what we didn't like.
Okay, well, we'll discuss it in more detail, but I thought it was generally subpar acting,
Hmm.
except for a couple of the old pros
Yeah.
that had smaller parts. Um, and we'll get into that. I found it a little confusing to being a neophyte on this war, a little confusing about who was fighting who and where.
Yeah.
And so it was a little hard to follow in that sense. And I thought this isn't really a complaint, but it's a little ironic that a movie that was released to time with the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of America really had nothing to do with that. In fact, it was Washington endeavoring and hungering to be part of the British elite and establishment. And I just thought that's a little kind of, obviously it's Washington, so that relates, but kind of strange that it was marketed as a this is where and how we celebrate America 250 at the movies by talking about Washington fighting for the British, not against them.
You're right about that. One thing we've talked about the Angels business model, and one thing I didn't like, and you already mentioned this, when Kelsey Grammer come on the screen to ask for money so that other people can go to see this patriotic movie. We know that every filmmaker has a point of view and a story to tell, but this appeal made the movie seem like overt propaganda. If you compare it to Mel Gibson's The Patriot, which is even more a piece of anti-British propaganda than this, but it doesn't say so deliberately, and as a result, it has plausible deniability as just a exciting war movie. So that appeal at the end kind of made it look like, this is a piece of propaganda, and you should support us because of the message that we're.
Yeah, I didn't like that. In fact,
You
as I
said you
said,
walked out,
I
so
walked out it, but I knew it was happening. I heard it coming on, and but my popcorn was gone, so why should I stick around?
I can't believe you had the popcorn. Um,
Absolutely.
I'm too old now to have popcorn. It makes me
Um,
upsets my digestion. One other thing about the Angel movies, I mean, in general, I like the idea of the Angel studio movies, but they don't have much of a sense of humor. I guess we are no longer, I guess we no longer believe that Washington never said, "I cannot tell a lie," but it's completely plausible that he might have said, "I cannot tell a joke." Um, but even if it's historically accurate to portray Washington himself as a stiff, I think the movie would have been a little bit more believable if it had leavened the seriousness of the plot with a little wryness and, like
yeah,
someone
I
must
think
have made a
that's
joke.
fair. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I just wondered why. I think I mentioned this to you when we first were talking about this movie. What kind of marketing was it to have it not come out until July 3rd or July 4th? Maybe it would be, it's like starting your Christmas sale on Christmas Eve and your Christmas marketing push. I wonder if they should have made a big push the week before. I don't know.
Well, I can't they were pretty successful. It was, it
Yeah,
made quite a lot that was a 3-day weekend, of course. And,
yeah,
if you wanted to go to the movies, that was a weekend to do it. And you're right, it's not a patriotic movie per se, except to this extent, and I'll talk about this later, that it did show how kind of snotty the British were and how it was a good thing that we declared our independence from them. And it was about George Washington, but
yeah.
um,
My theaters, my local theaters, of course, they all have this reserved seats where
yeah,
you go online, you look at the seat maps.
yeah,
And I went to the nine, there was a 9 a.m. showing on Friday, July 3rd. And yes, I still had popcorn. And there were only about 10 people.
yeah,
But I looked at the seat maps for later in the day, and they were two-thirds sold out the
yeah.
day before. So I think they had a very strong opening.
Yeah, I think it was like $25 million that weekend. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, there's something else that bugged me about the movie. And this is something I call the Downton Abbey rule of three, because that show, Downton Abbey, never trusted its viewers to understand the larger themes. So it repeated them 3 times. And in this case, 3 different characters make the chess analogy that a pawn can capture a king. I don't know.
Right.
I got it after once. I did twice. I was totally okay. I definitely have it that time, but I didn't need to be told that 3 times. And also, 3 people warn Washington that the British have sent him to confront the French, so they can blame him for it if it fails. So, and there are other examples about this. I mean, the writing was a little didactic, and it's like we just want to make sure you understand the point we're making here.
Yeah, and this gets into the what the movie was trying to accomplish, but there were three or four lines, all of which I liked. Um, about how, failure is a good teacher.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But, that gets to the what's it trying to accomplish.
All right. Well, let's talk about what it's trying to accomplish. What do you think?
You go first.
Okay. So I think it's trying to accomplish two things. First, the movie's making an important historical point. We learned in school that the colonies revolted because they didn't want to pay taxes. That's one thing. In his most recent documentary, Ken Burns says it's all about land, that the Americans wanted to expand west into the Indian land and the British wouldn't allow it. And of course, the 1619 Project said the Patriots had a fit because the British wanted to get rid of slavery, which was ridiculous. But this maybe makes a more fundamental point. The British class system just couldn't survive here. There's no place for a loyal but upwardly mobile and ambitious guy like George Washington to go. He wanted to serve the king, but they wouldn't have him in the regular army. And when they didn't allow him to serve in the local, when they did allow him to serve in the local militia, they offered to pay him half as the regular army, which is,
Yeah.
just an insult. Americans were less formal, less class conscious, more egalitarian, and more willing to break norms. There was no way the rigid British were going to lord it over us forever. When the movie ends, Washington is still a loyal subject, but you can tell he's seething with resentment at the way he's been treated by the snooty Brits. So, I mean, I think that's one thing that's making the point is that the reason, basically, when you are controlled by an outside power that is humiliating you, you are going to push back. And, eventually just people can be insulted only so much. And instead of trying to look at all these complicated financial reasons for the revolt, sometimes it's just people are tired of being pushed around.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the history of colonization, you see there's probably many examples
Yeah.
of where people colonists tried to get into the system and they
Yeah.
became, junior officials, in the colonial masters apparati. But then eventually it just cracked under the pressure and it became, point of resentment. Um, I think it was trying to bring the remote Washington to life
Hmm.
and show some of the experiences and qualities and lessons and especially mistakes, as we were told over and over, that made him the great man that he became. It was kind of a wannabe young Mr. Lincoln, although
Yeah.
unfortunately they didn't have a Henry Fonda.
Yeah.
And even though Washington led the country and died as a slave owning elite, it showed his relatively humble start, no formal education, not accepted by the stuffy British high society, had to scrape and fight for every crumb. And it showed that he was a man of great ambition and not yet the wise, above the battle, benign figure that we think of. And it also struck me watching all this play out that how much that fate or the divine hand, if that's what you believe, determines the course of history and America. If you believe in the great man of history, and I kind of sort of do, this film is showing how easy it was for anyone in Washington's situation to get killed before they had a chance to ever make history. I mean, all the illnesses, the battlefield risks, the weather risks, the flukes of a bullet missing by a millimeter, um, you know, shows you how fragile life was in those days. And of course, the fact that he would eventually die before the age of 70 in kind of a fluke, silly way, in a way, kind of underscores that at the very end.
Well, I'm going to build on the point you were making there, and go little bit further. I think the movie is a vote in favor of American exceptionalism, the belief that there's not only something special about our country, but that God is looking out for us. When all looks most hopeless for Washington and his fellow surveyor, Washington utters the immortal line, "Do you believe in miracles?" And then he literally walks on water. Now,
Right,
granted,
right.
they're stuck on a little island in the middle of a river, and when they wake up, the river has frozen enough so that he can walk to safety. And later, when Washington survives the climactic battle, they find 4 bullet holes in his clothing, a couple in his hat. Two horses have been shot out from under him, and he's not even grazed. the Indians who are trying to shoot him explain that he has divine protection. And I read a whole book once about many unbelievable coincidences, lucky breaks that helped America during a treacherous time, which concluded that God intervenes and he wants America to succeed. And I think there's a little bit of an element to that. This is a religious studio, and I think they're trying to say that God is on our side.
I agree with that. I think that's well stated sort of undercurrent of this movie. And it's also, and whether you're a big believer or not, it's also true how just but little twists of fate could have changed the whole, the whole history of the country. And of course, we could come up with a million examples of that ever since.
Well, I think I was telling, I forget when we talked about this before, it was pretty recently, I think, but when Washington was trying to escape from the British in Brooklyn, as a matter of fact, his army was backed up against the river, and it was getting dark, and the British general was gonna swoop down and kill them in the morning, and overnight this fog rolled in and
Yeah,
allowed the Americans to escape. Now, it's just weird coincidences. Fog comes in, saves the American army, saves George Washington, and they escape under, that's the kind of thing that's in this book. You've got
right.
these really crazy coincidences and oh, I know when it was when we were talking about pressure. When
And the weather.
when
Yeah.
the weather blew in our way, when the weather just seemed miraculously to open up for just a short amount of time, so the Americans and the English could invade on D-Day.
Of course, the pragmatic part of me says that it's easy to do those after the fact.
Oh, sure.
You
I mean,
know,
you
because
know,
what about all the other twists that resulted in great, wonderful things happening in our lives or the country's life that didn't happen
yeah,
because something went wrong?
yeah. No, I know.
So,
I
but
know.
still, I think it's definitely a theme here.
Well, if you read that book, I mean, it was example upon example. It's like, I can't believe that happened, and I can't believe that happened. And when you come up with 30 different examples like that, it's like, well, I can see like I get what they're talking about, and I
Yeah,
can see
yeah.
how it can appeal to someone. Anyway,
Um,
let's talk about the actors. The movie lives and dies on the actor who plays Washington. Our actor here is William Franklin Miller, a 22-year-old British actor, best known as a male model, although he did appear as one of Lorenzo de' Medici's sons in the British TV series Medici, and he had a part in the Chinese film Donji Rescue, which I'm sure I didn't see, and I'm sure you didn't either. So he's completely unknown in the United States. What do you think?
I wasn't that impressed, and I wanted to be impressed because I always sort of root for
Yeah,
young person getting their first big break on the big screen, and this was his first lead role. At times, he seemed as wooden as the false wooden teeth that Washington didn't have, but he he was he was towering in height as Washington was, so he was the right. They were well over 6 feet, both Washington and Franklin Miller, and he was the right age, and he also, I think, handled the athleticism that was required in the battle scenes very well. So I wouldn't say he was bad, but I do think he dragged the film down somewhat. But he didn't make it die.
yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I thought he was at best adequate. So he was tall enough, but he wasn't stocky enough. I have a feeling that Washington was kind of an amazing physical specimen to have survived all the hardships he went through. And he just kind of lacked the spark that makes someone into a movie star. He didn't have much, he didn't have any charisma. So you don't really understand what made men want to follow him. So
Yeah,
he looks okay, but
yeah. I will say he also benefited from the reality that no one really knows what
yeah,
Washington looked and sounded like, especially early on. He didn't have to compete with the fixed image like the poor actors that have had to play the Kennedys over the years, for example. Um, so again, I thought, you know, you said at the beginning the movie lives or dies on that actor. I don't think he was that good, but I don't think he killed the movie.
Yeah. Okay. Well, he had a pretty, the movie has a couple of better known supporting actors. We've already mentioned Kelsey Grammer, who plays Thomas Fairfax, who's the largest landowner in the country. What do you think about him?
Well, my eyes lit up when he came on the screen. I mean, every time I liked his scenes a lot. I thought he was good, um, and comforting in a way, frankly, just to see, you know, an experienced, savvy, familiar actor come on the screen in a film that had sort of a bunch of younger Brits to a
Yeah, I
degree.
thought he did a pretty good job channeling his inner Fraser Crane. It's not hard to believe that someone like Thomas Fairfax was just a tiny bit pompous, but willing to be charmed by a younger version of himself, which is kind of what Washington was in that case.
Yeah,
By the way, Kelsey Grammer is both a Republican and a born again Christian, so it's not a surprise that he's been in more than one of these Angel Studios movies.
right.
We have an Oscar winner in this movie, Ben Kingsley, who played Gandhi way back a million years ago, is cast as Virginia Lieutenant Governor Thomas Dinwiddie. Very good as an imperialist. It's hard to understand why he chose Washington to lead that expedition to the French. I don't think it was because you could blame Washington if it failed, because when it does fail, he tells Washington not to resign his commission in disgrace because it would reflect poorly on him for choosing Washington in the first place. I mean, he's an
Yeah.
experienced actor. What do you think?
I thought he was fine. I mean, he didn't, for some reason, he didn't make a huge impression on me. And it might have been in part because as these characters were being introduced, Fairfax and Dinwiddie and a couple of the others, half of my brain was trying to like place who they were and what their role was. And so I didn't focus as much on the acting. I mean, I didn't know who Dinwiddie and Fairfax were till I saw this movie.
Yeah,
I
well,
just
yeah.
I
No,
just wasn't that acquainted with the history, colonial history.
yeah, well, I didn't know who he was either. And I think he's a pretty, the British have a certain way of being British, and well, they have different ways of being British, and he was one of the ways, which is
Yeah,
kind of very stern and bureaucratic, and you used to getting his way and used to being deferred to, and he did a good job with that. Now,
yeah,
Andy Serkis is best known for playing Gollum in the Lord of the Rings movies, which I have seen. And whenever I see his name, I think, how is Gollum going to be in this movie? But there he is, General Edward Braddock. We've seen British generals like him before in movies. You have to wonder how they were able to conquer half the world with guys who won't listen to local experts and think that fighting in the wilderness is like fighting on the fields of
open
France.
field. Yeah,
Yeah, I
I
mean,
thought
how did they win? How did they get like a third of the world as their empire?
wasn't he the one that said at one point, "Never before have I been defeated by a tree."
Yeah,
Because their advance was stopped by wilderness.
a
There
tree fell
are
down, and it took them
yeah
half a day to cut it
yeah
off so they could move. Yeah.
yeah, but I thought he was in a film that I don't note for its acting. I thought he was probably the best actor in the film. His scene where he was mortally wounded and he told, Washington to go on and all that, I thought was kind of touching. And I think it also showed that in those days, generals got killed too.
Oh yeah.
They were on the front lines. They were in the midst of all the battle scrum, Civil War the same. And it was only in modern warfare where you sit sort of away from the action, and now you sit in the Pentagon somewhere at a screen directing things. But anyway, I thought he was good.
I thought so too. I mean, he's another character who's initially dismissive of Washington, but who gains grudging respect for him. And at the very end, he actually seems like a bit of a father figure to
Yeah.
someone who's kind of always looking for a father.
Hmm.
And at the end where he gives Washington the sash, that actually happened. I mean,
Mm.
that scene is pretty accurate.
Yeah.
Okay. Ma Washington is played by Mary Louise Parker, who's a global Globe winning actress, and she also won some Emmys. She's probably best known for being in TV shows like The West Wing and Weeds, which I did not watch, but I am familiar with her name.
Yeah.
Um,
I thought she was kind of stiff. I don't know whose fault it was, but the scenes between her and George it didn't really work that much for me. I put her in the category of subpar, just like I put in the category of subpar the Fairfax's daughter,
yeah,
the flirtation uh,
daughter-in-law. Yeah.
daughter-in-law, yeah, the one that George was flirting with, only to find out that she was married. And so, yeah, not that impressed.
Women characters in historical dramas like this are not have a very rewarding role. She's playing the loyal mother, doesn't really take a lot of effort. She's portrayed as loving, but there's an odd moment where she sends him a message while he's out in the wilderness asking him to procure some butter for her. And apparently she in her some historians do not like her at all because she was always on his back asking for money. And, she was a starving widow at one point, and she never quite got over that. Was always asking Washington for help with stuff. And he actually, I mean, that 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 line, which is so weird that he's, can you get me some butter when he's out like a million miles away from a 7-Eleven, is actually happened. I mean, she was always doing stuff like that. In reality, she wasn't quite as loving and maternal as portrayed here.
Yeah.
But anyway, I agree with you. I don't really like that part. You have any others you want to talk about?
Well, I did like John Foss, who played Lawrence Washington. I didn't
Okay.
know, I don't know anything about him, but I thought the character of Lawrence was sympathetic. The scenes were kind of, a little bit hokey, but I liked the scenes where he tried to sort of fill in as a father figure, helped George continue his ad hoc education, and was kind of a touchstone for George. And then, of course, met his own end, and which made George Washington sad. So I sort of liked both the actor and the sideline storyline of it.
Yeah, no, Lawrence Washington is, is your classic good guy in this movie, looking out for
Yeah.
his younger half brother. It's funny. He was when Pa Washington died. His name is Augustine. When he
Yeah.
died, he left Mount Vernon to his first son, who's the son of Augustine Washington's first wife, and left a much smaller um, farm to his existing wife, where she had to support. They don't show these other kids. It's actually four Washington boys, of which George is the oldest.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, so he was a good character too. I like that guy.
Yeah.
Let's talk about John Irwin, whose career is based on making explicitly Christian movies.
Yeah. Christian movies and football movies. He's being from Alabama. That's his second religion. In fact, he began as a cameraman at Crimson Tide football games, and he made a couple of, you know, inspiring football movies alongside his Christian movies. Obviously, I haven't seen any, probably the football players as they won, thanked God for that. I thought it was competent and workmanlike. The action scenes um, were suspenseful. And as I said, the sets were mostly realistic and nicely shot. I felt I was in the milieu.
I agree. I thought it was certainly very capably directed. I mean, he's not Steven Spielberg or anything, but you know, uh, I definitely felt like it was the 1750s. I didn't get impatient and feel like he was treating me like an especially slow high school history student, which sometimes happens in these overtly Christian movies. Um, I he also is probably better known for until up till now for directing The House of David, which is a TV series about King David. I watched about 20 minutes of that, and it felt like a made-for TV movie, which is what it was.
Mhm.
And I just didn't find it very interesting. So I was happy to see that, he did a good job here. All right, let's turn to the history or the accuracy of the movie. You any nits you want to pick or other?
Well, not really. From what I know and what I could find, the broad outlines of the French-Indian War and the Washington's role in this particular period in Washington's life, and the class and status divide between the British rulers and the colonists, all was pretty accurate. And I think even critics of the movie didn't find too many, you know, didn't come up with too many historical complaints. Of course, many of them wanted slavery much more
Hmm.
emphasized, but that's par for the course. So I think overall it's trustworthy on the broad history.
Yeah, their slavery was mentioned only once when uh, they were recruiting people to be in the militia, and one guy instead of serving himself, he sent several slaves, which made you think, okay, so that's what the life of a slave was, to be not considered to be worth anything other than the financial, financial benefit they give to the owner or the ability to get him out of being in the army. But
Well, didn't slavery, wasn't there also a snippet of a scene where when George was trying to crash that fancy party
oh yeah,
at the
there were slaves.
Fairfaxes, and the slaves are the ones that helped him get
Yeah,
in
you're
through
right,
the
right,
back
right.
way.
The house
So
slaves.
that
Yeah,
was actually a touch of sympathetic portrayal
yeah.
of let's all team up against the overseers.
I think this movie is like LBJ, a movie we recently talked about, that's surprisingly accurate. It's big themes about Washington's rise from a fatherless, unschooled, financially insecure childhood to an overly ambitious military leader who makes a lot of mistakes but learns from them, is basically true. The geopolitical stuff is true. Um, the colonies, the battle scenes are true. A lot of details which seem kind of strange are true. There were a couple of liberties taken to make it, to smooth things out and make Washington look slightly better. Washington did fall in love with his friend George Fairfax's wife, Sally, but it was long after they were married, not before. In this movie, he falls in love with a girl that he doesn't know is about to be engaged to George Fairfax. In real life, they were friends, and it was basically his best friend's. He fell in love with his best friend's wife and sent her letters. So they didn't. They smoothed that out to make it seem more respectable. Yeah, and
But on
not
the other
someone who's trying to
hand,
break up someone's marriage.
yeah, but on the other hand, it's not by emphasizing so much his defeats and his stubbornness and his refusing to listen to advice and the fact that at Fort Necessity he actually surrendered. He did sign a surrender after losing a battle. Um, this is people might get the idea that because this is movie producers lean conservative or Christian, that it's some kind of whitewash or hagiography. It's not. It really emphasizes sort of the dumb mistakes he made, and he wouldn't listen to advice.
Absolutely. I mean, well, first of all, he was only 22 years old. I mean, can you
Right.
imagine putting, like a college senior in charge of a bunch of an army to go in and try and kick the French out of a fort that they're already in? I mean, of course you're going to lose. Yeah, no, I mean, and that's the theme of the movie, really, that he wasn't always a hero. But he made himself into a hero by learning from his mistakes and
Yeah,
humbling himself. And all that is true.
yeah.
And he did goof up and put forth necessity this stockade fence up in the middle of a riverbed.
And
Uh,
didn't just do that, but specifically ignored advice that he shouldn't do it.
right, right.
Which is I think is this is not sugarcoating.
Yeah, yeah,
Now, naturally, in any historical dramatization, there's going to be numerous scenes of characters interacting with each other and having conversations that are all fictionalized, and that's okay by me. If you don't want that, just watch documentaries and
right.
don't watch dramatizations. This is a dramatization.
Yeah, yeah. There was one thing that is a little bit off about the battle at the end, the battle of let me see if I pronounce this right. I forget it. Mahanga I guess is what it's called.
We've just alienated our Pennsylvania listeners.
Yeah. It's kind of portrayed, you leave thinking that there's some sort of a British, that George Washington turned the tide and turned it into a British victory. In fact, it was a rout. Washington's contribution was to make it a somewhat more orderly retreat than it was shaping up to be. But I'm fine with this
Mhm.
alteration because it makes for a more triumphal conclusion.
Yeah.
And it was good. I also want to mention and something I didn't learn until literally today was that during that battle there's a British officer who's friends with Washington and who falsely claims that General Braddock ordered a retreat. And this guy is named Thomas Gage, which
Yes.
did ring a bell with me. But it wasn't until today that I figured out that he's the guy who becomes British commander during the Revolutionary War. He was the guy that was in charge of blockading Boston and was in charge of the Battle of Bunker Hill and all that kind of stuff. So it's interesting that
Mm.
these two legitimate friends will become wartime adversaries 20 years later.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have any favorite scenes? What is your favorite scene?
I touched on most of them, but I liked the climactic battle scene. I thought it was built up the suspense quite well, and a touch of sadness as the general is mortally wounded. Um, I liked the scene where the movie veered off and became kind of a buddy film, and where
Yeah.
Washington and Theodore Gist, the explorer, have teamed up to go and do some surveying, and they run into trouble when their raft they're on flips and they're stranded on the island, and they're about to freeze to death. But as you mentioned, the river froze over overnight, and it wouldn't be an angel film without somebody walking on water, and so they were able to walk to their rescue. Um, I mean, that's buddy films are a favorite among American audiences, and it became that for a few minutes, and I like that.
Yeah, no, I like that too. And I will say that that this walking on water thing actually did happen, except it's slightly different in terms of the historical record. They were already river was already frozen over when they were walking across it, and they slipped and fell in, and they managed to get to that island. They managed to get to that island, and then overnight it froze even more and was more solid when they woke up. So it wasn't like they were in a raging, falling down going over the rapids and everything. And all of a sudden the movie froze because the river froze because that's not how physics works. But it was close. I mean, they were actually stranded on an island and they walked away. So it's close enough.
Yeah, closer than Peter Sellers walking on water at the
Yeah,
end of being there.
that's right. That's right. That's a good point. Um, I liked, well, of course, I liked that. My favorite scene was the battle scene at the end. Very exciting. It was not thrilling exactly, but it was pretty exciting. It was, when Washington's running back and forth and getting shot at. It was a great action sequence.
Yeah, and how anyone does that after having debilitating dysentery
which was
is
true,
amazing.
which had
Is
happened.
amazing.
It
Yeah.
absolutely happened in real life.
And then to die of a common cold basically at age 67.
After your physicians bleed you to death.
Right. I know it's crazy.
I know. Well, let's cut.
Now,
Let's
was that the fate of the Lord, or was that
Well,
just
at that point he was a spent force, but like let's open this vein a little bit, and like you can give me a pint of your blood, and your on the bad humors will come out with it. I mean,
amazing?
what are we talking about?
Yeah.
I like the scene where Washington approaches Braddock, who's very arrogant about how he's going to wipe out the French and Indians. He calls it a waste of powder and shot, and how Washington eventually convinces him to take him along. The arrogance of the British is off the charts in this movie, which else explains why the colonists declared independence 20 years later. I already mentioned that,
Hmm.
but I thought that was a good scene.
Yeah. Yeah.
I also like the closing sequence where George Washington receives a well-deserved recognition and a promotion, and he trades his red coat for a blue uniform, signaling his future role in the revolution. And this is based on the idea that the red coats, easy targets in the he doesn't want the red uniform anymore because they're an easy target in the forest. The blue coat will blend in more, and it's also cheaper to make because blue is grown by these indigo farmers in the south, and getting the blue dye is cheaper than getting the red dye.
That is so interesting, Gary.
I know,
I never knew that.
so
I,
interesting,
I
and
never
something
knew that.
another thing I learned just today. It's a good thing we put off doing this podcast for so long because I could find out all these little tidbits. Let's see, anything else? All right, let's go to favorite lines. As I said,
Um,
get any. I'm not sure there's a lot of real wit in this movie, and if there was, it was hard to get it down on paper fast enough. But what do you got for favorite lines?
well, a whole bunch of them.
Okay.
Failure is the tutor sent by God, his mother to George. For most, failure is the end. For you, it's only the beginning. The governor to George. Those kind of lines.
If you don't learn from it, you fail twice. If you do learn from it, you've earned wisdom.
Right. And of course, we are pawns, George, but even a pawn can
Yeah.
take on a king. That was Lawrence to George. Um, I like to lead is to forfeit the right to make excuses. The governor said that, I
Yeah.
think, to George. A line, of course, that all of our politicians, CEOs, and others have remembered up to this day, not to make excuses for
Yeah.
failure. Um, and I like that. I chuckled at they had this arrogant French guy sitting down with a kind of a peace talks with George on his first foray out to the wilderness. And he said, "You do not want to start a war. Take your pet savage and go."
Mm,
It was, that was during that diplomacy
yeah.
dinner they had where George was trying to deliver the message that the French should get out.
When Lawrence tells George complains about something, and Lawrence says, "That's not the way the world works." And he says, then someone should remake it. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and uh,
Yeah.
and they did remake the world.
And then one of the Indians said to Washington, "You call this land the New World, but you live by the old ways."
Yeah.
It's another line that evokes this notion of this was a slow motion revolution in the making on the
Yeah.
part of the colonists.
Oh, well, also the French military officer, he says, who does own this land if not the one who has the will to tame it? And, that's real honest, real world politics. I
And
mean,
true throughout human history,
true throughout human history,
and will ever
and
be
will ever
true.
be so. If you
Right.
want, if you want to keep your land, you defend it. If you want to take your land, you take it. I mean, we do have these rules over the last 100 years or so, but we've seen power after power break them. So And then as finally, I would rather die unknown than live believing the world's measure of me is fixed. So,
Hmm. Yeah, that's
okay.
interesting.
What about so do you think this movie has any relevance or any way you can compare it to politics and society today?
Well, I think this notion, only in some sort of sad ways, I think the notion that failure is a good teacher and that you should own up to your mistakes and your failures, and that will serve you well. I'm not sure is true today in either politics or in the careerism and the credentialism that we've fallen into. I mean, if you're in the professional world and you make a huge mistake like Washington made, or you get summarily fired, you know, can we really bounce back from those things in the eyes of others? I'm not so sure.
Well, not in this world of social media.
Right, right.
Um, a kind of a related thing. I mean, this movie is a great reminder that the thing that made America great was the creation of a society where you could rise by merit, not by birth. You know, our greatest presidents, Washington, Lincoln, Eisenhower, Reagan, all came from pretty modest beginnings. And I'm concerned that we're becoming a more calcified society where social mobility is not what it used to be. You have
Yeah,
bad schools, regulations that make it harder to start a business. You know, barriers like this make it harder for populations without privilege to get ahead.
yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, if you were a high school teacher, would you assign this movie?
Yes, I would. There's enough biographical and historical material to expand upon in lessons, and the movie is tasteful in terms of the violence, and there's no issues with language or sex. So I think it's appropriate if the teacher has the time to go into this much detail about that period in history.
Yeah, I would say this movie is tailor-made for being shown on high school high school history class. You know, you want to start teaching them about the early America. This is a good way to do it. You show them the movie, and there's a lot of good lessons in here, not only about Washington, about the British and you know, how the colonies were set up and so on and so forth. So I think it's good.
Yeah,
So I would definitely say it. All right, how would you grade the movie?
I give it a B minus. It's just enough of a grade for me to recommend to folks. They can catch it in the theaters, or it'll probably be in streaming soon if it isn't already. And it's a movie that can be watched with the whole family. And I'm looking forward to the sequel.
Yeah, I would give it an A for a history lesson, a B for dialogue and overall movie making. So average it out to a B plus or an A minus. So
Oh, I'm
once
surprised.
I'm the yeah
Actually,
yeah I know I'm usually the harder grader. So I guess I enjoyed it more than you do. Okay, any final words on this movie?
no, I'm waiting for the sequel and the trilogy.
The
I think would
trilogy,
be a
yeah.
great trilogy.
I want to just mention, as usual, podcast is available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and most podcast platforms. You can subscribe there. If you have any comments, you can email me, GaryHolmes76 at Gmail. We decided on our next movies, next two movies? I think we did,
Well,
right?
we were talking about the Manchurian Candidate,
Right.
the
The original.
classic and the remake.
These are two fictionalized movies, but I think it will tell us a lot about how people saw politics in the 1960s and in the what is it, 90s, when the
I
Second
think it
World
was the
War.
90s,
Yeah.
if not the early 2000s.
I've seen the original, which is a fantastic movie. Have not
Right.
seen the remake, so I'm gonna do a comparison sake. So these are two separate episodes, not just one. So go out and watch those movies now. Okay, let's say goodbye. I'll see you later, Jim. Au revoir.
Take care.
Bye bye.